All right, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Custody Queens Off the Clock. I'm Sam McBride. I'm here with my favorite blonde, Kristen Holstrom, and also Glitch DNA Labs. So we're very excited to dive into the very real world truth behind cases that everyone is talking about and the details that often mainstream coverage doesn't really get right. So we want to kind of start to get deeper and get into those details.
Oh, this is a big one. If you followed the Idaho 4 case for even 5 minutes, you heard the people yelling, touch DNA, trace DNA, the sheets, 1 in a trillion, all of it. And we're going to get the final word here. But you know us, we want to know what all of this actually means. And I am super excited about this one.
Yeah, and because the Idaho 4 conversations, we hear a lot of things like touch DNA, and it's certainly become a buzzword, but I feel like this sort of phrase, touch DNA, has some sort of stamp of certainty, and it really doesn't deserve that. The science is not that simple, and how DNA gets onto something, how long it stays, and who else it may have touched are things that we really need to consider. And that's the part that no one's explaining.
And Audrey from Glitch DNA, she is from the Glitch Lab DNA. She's gonna walk us through some questions that Sam and I have put together. We're gonna talk about the likelihood, probabilities, activity level propositions, transfer and persistence, and all of these things that we all want to know more about. So without further ado, let's jump into it. And Audrey, we are so excited to have you.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we really are. And so Audrey, she translates dense DNA labs into plain language, which is what we all need to sort of know. And as attorneys, Kristen and I are California family law attorneys, but we know how important it is to really get down to the details of why things are the way they are. And sometimes investigation policy gaps can lead to wrongful convictions. And so we want to focus on the difference between DNA in a file and what it actually proves about a case or doesn't prove in some circumstances.
And how does secondary transfer DNA? How does that even work with investigations? All right, so let's dive into it, Sam. These are the questions that lawyers should be asking if they're ever involved in a case regarding DNA. And I am excited. Let's just jump right into it. Audrey, welcome. You want to tell everyone a little bit about who you are, what you do, and how you got into this crazy case?
So yes, I'm Audrey. By day, I work in hospital billing and compliance. And then by night, I'm an independent forensic analysis. And so when I first heard about DNA with this case on the mainstream media, I immediately knew what kind it was. And it was because of what they weren't saying. And I heard the general consensus about how everybody was talking about this DNA. So I wanted to provide information about what trace DNA actually is. And so I could educate future jurors or maybe future Idaho jurors to understand this is not a blood stain. This is something very different. And it does not place any defendant at a scene. So I wanted to be very cautious and just try to translate these complex ideas and tools so that people could easily understand that this is not, trace DNA is not a sentence.
So let's start with something that we hear constantly when we're talking about the Idaho 4 conversations. What's one thing about touch DNA that is commonly misunderstood by the public?
So the term touch DNA is a misnomer. It assumes the mechanism of travel. And what that is it primary? Is it secondary? Is it tertiary? And a lot of times with trace DNA, it's invisible to the naked eye, so it doesn't have a timestamp. So when the prosecution says their theory is this was direct contact during crime time, that might not actually be the case. And so touch DNA is a story. Here's mine, that this defendant touched a key piece of evidence. When the word touch is shorthand. So using it is, for one, just not accurate, and two, it assumes direct transfer, and we just don't know that information.
Yeah, and it seems like some of the problem with just the word DNA is I think that the general public a lot of times goes, well, the DNA is there, so that must be science, and it must mean that he did it. And it's a much bigger conversation than that. So that's very interesting, definitely.
No, I agree. And you are right, Audrey. You hear the word touch with the DNA and you assume that he had, whoever the defendant is, in this case, we're talking about BK, that he had to have touched something at the crime scene that would put him there. I would say that's probably what I initially thought when I heard about the touch DNA, and that's why I'm so glad you're on, because we need to have a better way to understand what these words are and what these processes are and what this science is. It's not super easy for a lot of people to wrap their head around and then fully understand it. It's kind of like when you're studying law. You might be able to recite a law from 1500s, but you don't necessarily understand what that law means or what it was applied to. And I think that that's something that goes along a lot with respect to the content that's out there and DNA. So I agree with you. Okay, but now I want you to explain in plain language how we can see a dramatic statistic like 1 in a trillion even when the underlying sample is so incredibly weak or fragile.
So, especially in the Koberger case, we've heard that octillion number. It just ripples throughout everything. And no matter if it is a big blood stain or a trace DNA sample, you're going to get that same number. But what people don't realize is there's a particular way that trace or low template DNA behaves in the lab. Blood is robust, so it's going to go through quality control. It's going to be much easier for them to run their software on it. Whereas, so the octillion is called a likelihood ratio. And what that is, it's when the DNA tech is asking a question. Is the defendant's DNA the source, or is the source an unrelated person? So when you ask that question, it completely bypasses the how and the when, the timestamp of this type of DNA. Because usually when it's blood, somebody needs to be there to spill their blood. So there is sort of a timestamp on that. And so a lot of times the court will compress together the likelihood ratio, this octillion number, with he did it. But the other things we need to consider are the TPPR, the transfer, persistence, relevance, and recovery. Transfer is the mechanism of travel. Was it primary transfer, direct transfer, secondary transfer? Persistence, your timestamp. How long has it been there? Relevance, how common is it for there to be DNA in this area on this surface? And recovery, it's the recovery you do in the lab. And a lot of people don't realize contamination can happen at any point, from even before the crime, during the crime, and even with recovery and in the lab. And the next one is the activity level. There are two hypotheses with that. The first one is the defendant did the criminal activity. The second is the defendant did an alternate activity, an innocent activity. And so both of those hypotheses are true until the evidence supports one or the other. And usually the prosecution, their hypothesis is the defendant did the criminal activity, and the defense's hypothesis is usually the defendant did an alternate activity. But there's also one more thing in there called thresholds and dropout. Thresholds is literally like a line that you'll see when you're looking at this software, so you can see where the analytical threshold is. Anything below that analytical threshold, they'll just call it inconclusive. There could be other contributors in there, but they don't go below that analytical threshold, and it's different in every lab. So they're calling peaks above that. And then so when you're right there at that threshold, do we even trust this sample? Because there were a couple of things that I found in the lab reports that were released by ISP. And it was the first step after extraction where there was a standards failure, which means on the first try, the first step, their quality control checks kicked in and said, this sample, this extract is not good enough. And then on the second
Is
one,
that because they didn't have enough, or what would be a reason for that to indicate that?
they're hitting that analytical threshold. So it's borderline interpretability there.
Okay.
And so on the second one, their internal lane standard failed, which is their ruler to measure these peaks of these alleles, because they're looking for that repetition, because that's the STR, the standard tandem repeat. But when your quality control is telling you no more than once, that is a very fragile profile. With a robust blood stain, it's not going to have those issues. Usually it runs through the software and you're going to get feedback output just like a regular workflow. But with this,
So when you say fragile profile, what exactly does that mean?
it's right there at that analytical threshold where, is this actually interpretable?
So are you suggesting that it's possible that the touch DNA is not as strong as some of the public may perceive it to be?
Absolutely. And then when you have this trace DNA versus a blood stain, the likelihood ratio that is thrown around, that octillion, that is going to not tell the whole story. So it's going to kind of be perched on top of this troubleshooting in the lab, this interpretability issue. But you're not going to know that because the likelihood ratio is asking a different question. And so that's why this different tool of asking about these thresholds and the drop in and the drop out and the quality control and your standards and policies in your lab and where you set these thresholds are almost more important than that likelihood ratio, especially in trace DNA cases.
Okay, wait, hold on. When you just said that there were thresholds, are these like independent to that lab and the people that are doing the test, or are these like standard, in the industry? Are these industry standard?
I wish they were industry standard, but they do sometimes go lab by lab. There are some standard boards out there like NIST and AAFS, the American Academy Association.
All right, Audrey. So what I'm hearing that you're saying is that there is some subjectiveness going on with these quality control numbers. It doesn't seem like they are standard, within the industry, and they're all kind of done at the same level. That's not what I'm hearing with some of these quality controls. Is that right?
That's right. A lot of these thresholds vary from lab to lab. There are some standards boards that give some guidance on where to set them, but they're ultimately set by these individual labs. That's exactly what happened when they had the DNA under Maddie's fingernails independently tested. And that's when they had Westrig, he wrote up that long report and he cited a lot of standards and policies and he compared them between different boards and the ISP lab. And he basically said, I agree that this is how they found out Koberger was excluded from the DNA under Maddie's nails, is because you have true allele and you have STR mix. This is software that they use. And it just so happened that true allele and STR mix, they have different thresholds. But Westrig agreed with the defense that Koberger is excluded. And so in the documentation, it was corrected because the state had him as inconclusive. And so really, and then he was even citing another standards board who put their thresholds in a different place. And so then you have all these different thresholds, and then you're also working with this fragile DNA that's right there at the analytical threshold. Where is this even interpretable? These likelihood ratios, these octillion numbers, you don't hear the story underneath that.
No, you don't.
So just so I'm kind of wrapping my mind around this, I think part of the problem with sort of mainstream media or us just as the public receiving the information of it's a 1 in a trillion possibility is we want to jump to the reaction of it couldn't possibly be anyone else and the case is shut, but it doesn't, that really is just relating to like the matched DNA probability, but it's not accounting for lab errors the standard of testing, the interpretation
Contamination.
different across the board. So all of those other variables are ignored when we're hearing the 1 in 1 trillion possibility. Is that a fair?
That's correct. Mhm.
That's wild. That is wild. That's wild. Oh my gosh, we have so many more questions. This is so good, Audrey. So good. Okay, so can you walk us through what failed runs and bad controls actually mean in a DNA lab report? Because most people have no idea what that signals, including myself.
Well, that's the good science. That's the science. That's their quality control. That's the system saying, no, this is not good enough, or this is not readable.
Okay, that's good. Well, I'm glad they have those safety protocols at least.
So just in general, when you're looking at trace DNA and it's a very serious case like this, are there certain things that you go to look for to interpret things first? Is there red flags? And are there red flags in this Idaho 4 case? It sounds like we sort of unanimously would say yes, there is, but what are they specifically?
Well, some of the red flags is how the narrative is framed. It's what they don't say. And that's how you know it's probably not blood, sweat, semen, or saliva, because the state knows trace DNA is the weakest type of DNA. So that would be red flag number 1. Red flag number 2 is they're going to put a very large likelihood ratio on it. There isn't even an octillion amount of people in the world. So when they're saying that this profile is rare within this population, the population isn't octillion. So that's another red flag. And another red flag are these standard failures, quant failures, ILS standards. The internal lane standard failure is the ruler that measures these peaks. Now, a lot of times they can troubleshoot these extracts, and they could find a real profile. But the issue with that is that an accurate representation of what's actually on the item, on the sheath? Because they're going to call a profile regardless.
Is that also in addition to the fact that in this case, we really don't have a timestamp for this type of DNA?
Yes, that is one of the big issues here.
With everything you just said, when you're reviewing a trace DNA in a serious capital murder case or a criminal case, what is the biggest red flag that you look for immediately?
I'm looking for what type of DNA it is, especially if it is a trace DNA case, because a lot of times the confidence that we should have in these trace DNA profiles, it's very complex. But a lot of times in court, even if an independent expert were talking about standards and these complexities, a lot of times the juries defer to the state expert. And even though there is another side of the room there is somebody else talking about the limitations of trace DNA, the confidence doesn't normally come down. The court keeps the confidence at that high number. And that can sometimes, yeah.
So I have a question, just because what's curious to me is, even if we find trace DNA, we find trace DNA in this house, can you break down the potential that maybe there was contamination or maybe a secondary transfer, and how can that happen? Like, does that happen in real life? Is it just me thinking this?
Yes, especially in a high traffic area. It goes against every standard board that I know of, where you would sideline the blood and raise the trace invisible DNA, especially in a high traffic area. I mean, I know a lot of times they rule out people's DNA that they think is supposed to be there. But then when you're doing that, you might be looking over potential suspects.
Right. You're just sort of assuming that somebody that had been in the house before, there's no way it was them. It has to be this new intruder. And with such a high traffic area, that seems quite concerning when you're looking at an investigation and the, tons, innumerable amount of potential suspects in my mind that should have been looked into a lot further.
Yeah. So Audrey, one of the things that Sam and I have talked a lot about is how, in this case specifically, that a lot of people were cleared almost immediately upon the beginning of the investigation, and it was a very large number that were cleared within a very relatively short period of time. And it sounds like the way that these tests were run potentially overlooked some potential suspects. Is that kind of what we're getting?
I would agree with that, yes.
Okay, so this is a personal question I have. What is the difference between the CODIS style testing and the forensic genealogy labs like Othram, right? The company that claims to have found BK within, I think it was 5 or 7 days is what was said at the crime convention. But what is the difference between those, and does that difference matter?
Difference does matter, because when I was talking about it before, where the ISP lab, they're going to call a profile regardless of what's there. And we have to ask ourselves, is that an actual representation of what's actually on the sheath or the item? It could be. We don't know. But that story is already told by the time it gets into that tube, and they're taking that tube over to Ortham Lab, who does something separate. They have 2 separate labs. They're doing 2 separate things. So at ISP lab, they're trying to extract the DNA, and they do what's called an STR, a short tandem repeat. Ortham, they're SNPs. They call them SNPs. And that's looking at different types of genes. And so what happens is when Ortham says, oh, we had tons of DNA, that's because the ISP lab could get that extract. They pushed the system to get that extract the way that they had it. So yeah, what Ortham is saying is they had enough DNA to do their IgG work, their workflow. And so you really do have 2 different stories there. But if there's anything that happens in that ISP lab that may not be accurate and might not tell the whole photograph of that sheath, Ortham is downstream. So anything downstream of this lab, they are going to inherit any of these issues.
And that makes sense. And I think that's why, again, sometimes these statistics, when they're released, they're released in such a vacuum when you're not looking at the potential of it, basically not being a good sample, or what type of DNA or how it got there or what time it got there. I think that that's where a lot of the confusion comes. So I wonder, are there phrases that you hear either prosecutors or the media or anyone, the public in general, say about DNA that sounds really specific, but you're, sitting there cringing because it just doesn't make sense, or it's not really a good representation of what's going on?
I hear a lot of people using Ortham to justify what's going on in the ISP lab, but Ortham is downstream. So you can't really use whatever they're doing in their lab to justify what happened in a completely different lab. It's not completely linear in that way. It can be if it is an accurate representation, but we don't know that. And the life cycle of this Q1.1 sample, what they found on the knife sheath, it could be right, but my confidence in it is not very high because of the problems. It behaved like low template DNA in the lab with those standard failures.
And the confidence doesn't really have to do with the 1 in trillion probability. It has to do with everything around that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what do you think that if Ann Taylor gets assigned to this case, she was the public defender at the time, and we got a lab report that says we found DNA on the knife sheath and it's your client's, what are like 3 automatic questions or red flags or something that Ann Taylor should have been ready to ask? Like, if, say Sam and I are taking a criminal defense case in the future, we don't, we're family law attorneys, but what is like the gut automatic, okay, my client's DNA, I'm being told that this is my client's DNA on this object. What are my 3 questions that I'm asking without question?
Policy, standards, and your verification methods.
I like it. I like it. Kind of, if we're trying to put an expert on the stand, we're basically going through those processes as well.
Can you give us an example of what a verification or validation method would be?
So what does a lab do when they come across errors? How do they address that, and what are their policies to do that?
Okay, that makes sense. So what I keep hearing, and I know we may sound like we're repeating ourselves, but I think it's a huge point here, is just because you hear a 1 in 1 trillion, or just because you hear there's a DNA match, that doesn't necessarily mean that we should have confidence in that statement, because we're not paying attention or considering the way that that DNA was extracted, how it was handled, whether there could be some transferability there, or whether it could be otherwise compromised.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, Audrey. So, and I'm going to kind of, my question just going to be like, it's on the same lines, but is it a fair assessment to say that potentially the way they ran it with ISP, right? The ISP lab, they didn't necessarily get the conclusion that was the most helpful to them. Do you think they turned around to use Othram potentially to get that answer or that conclusion they were looking for, or are those just not even comparable?
I'm not sure what their decisions were, but I do know it was an unknown male profile at some point. And so they tried to put that into their CODIS databases. And I think they actually may have used a national database as well, but they weren't getting any hits. And there is a DOJ policy that says if the case goes cold, then you can use IgG. But in this case, it was only a couple of weeks into the investigation. And that Ann Taylor had pointed out that those decisions were against that DOJ policy. And so you really are not supposed to, if you can't find anything in CODIS, start the IgG right away. You need to exhaust all your other investigative leads.
And you know what's funny about that is that that's one of their biggest pieces of evidence that they have in this case. And if we're saying it has to be a cold case, which is what the DOJ provision is, you're right. 3 weeks into it, it's not even remotely a cold case. And we don't even have the passage of time to support that they have exhausted all other legal remedies or scientific remedies to help come to the same conclusion. And I often wonder, I mean, this is the stuff that keeps Sam and I awake at night, is if they had never run that through IgG and didn't come to that conclusion, and then it was forced into the world through the media, would we still have the same result that we have here today? I don't know, but I think about that.
Yeah, and I think what concerns me is, I think it's a huge point to say that you're really not supposed to do something until you exhaust all other remedies, because when I think about that phrase, and I don't know exactly what that means, but to me it means, are we maybe shutting the door down on other roads that this investigation could have gone on? Are we ignoring the other potential profiles, or are we not putting as much time and resources towards that because now we've kind of taken a step away from that and figured something else out over here, and so this is our new case? So I think that while I don't know this to be true, it seems like that's probably part of the reason that you can't just run and use other potential means to get a match, if you will.
Yeah.
No, it's wild when you think about it like that. It really is. I do agree, Sam, that there is a likelihood that, hey, we already got the result we're looking for. And so I do think it's possible that maybe things that should have been tested immediately that, weren't tested. And I know that there are some things that were within the house that weren't tested that probably should have been tested. Now, you hear a lot on YouTube with respect to from content creators where they say they couldn't even run it again through CODIS because they only had enough to get it through the system once. I'm probably butchering this the way I'm saying it.
Yes, Brett Payne said that at the redacted hearing that they had. I don't know where he's getting that information from, but it's very misleading. You can put whatever profile you want in DECODIS. And I don't know if he was saying that sometimes law enforcement doesn't want to put a profile in DECODIS because it will stay there.
Yeah, I was under the impression that they only had so much DNA that when they ran it through the test, it basically used whatever was available, and they couldn't run it again.
So the sample was consumed. They did have some extract left over.
It's interesting how complicated this area is. And I feel like we could certainly talk to you forever about it. But I wonder too, Kristen, just quickly, yeah, maybe there was other things from a DNA standpoint that they should have been investigating or looking into further. But I wonder what the ripple effect is if we believe we have a DNA match that we just don't even go interview other people.
No,
right?
I agree. I agree.
So I think that ripple effect is probably far greater than we really are able to see. But so I know you kind of briefly mentioned this before. It's like it's not necessarily about what they're saying, it's about what they're not saying. So do you have any kind of comments or statements or opinions about what they're not saying? Meaning if someone was just to accurately go out to the public and say, well, what we actually have here is barely DNA that we can't verify as to time, and we can't actually place someone in a house, and we really, kind of look the other way with the standards of the DOJ in getting this. What are the sort of things that you think could have been said that maybe would bridge the gap between the public receiving maybe not misinformation, but receiving it in a way that appears certainly to me to be
persuasive,
providing everyone with a sense of misinformation?
Oh, are you talking about the media and their constant narrative?
Yes.
Right.
So I have a series on that. It's in my posts on YouTube where I call it the generated 360, where this is a generated ecosystem. And we are surrounded because it starts in the social media. So now PR firms, they can have bots. And so there's these bot farms that they basically farm the narrative, and they try to keep bringing it back to where they want it. And then the mainstream media reinforces that. And so what you have is an echo chamber, and they really did try to kind of stomp out these independent voices. And I know in the beginning, a lot of us were shamed for asking questions, and it should never be that way. And because I think it was a generated environment that we were all in. Still are a little bit.
No, I agree with you. And Sam and I also talk a lot about this. And before we even started our own channel, that was something we were like, hey, are we, we're going to get some harassment. We're going to get, people that don't like us following the evidence and asking questions like this. And Sam always makes a really good point is if your case was so tight, then if we kept turning over rocks, you wouldn't care because we wouldn't find anything. And in this case, every time we pull up a rock, we find more things. And we preach the same thing, that a lot of facts in this case, it is what the media isn't telling you that are really, really important. Just like with the DNA, it's not what they're telling you. It's what, if you don't know a lot about DNA, then you don't know the summarization of what you're saying. But the fact that they only found that one tiny piece of touch DNA, that says a lot. That they didn't find any other DNA from BK in his car, in his apartment, in his house or his parents' house in Pennsylvania. Like, walk us through that. Like, how is that possible?
So I think the state's entire case was inference. They inferred about the white vehicle. That was never an identification. There are no traffic cams with an actual license plate. What they did is a classification. That's much different than an identification. They classified a body style of a car and maybe a year. And the state was going to have, an FBI agent testify to, yeah, this is what the body style looks like and here are the ears. They wanted to present that to the jury so the jury would make that connection. Oh, that must be the car. And they were going to do the same thing with the cell phone, where they just suggested that he was in the area 23 times, but it was like, well, what does that even mean? And you have Cy Ray, who is a veteran and a pioneer of the entire field, and he said the state doesn't have the data to show what they're saying. And then even with the this Amazon purchase, they were going to have an accountant that's not a forensic accountant talk about buying habits. And then they were going to have a lay person from Amazon talk about algorithms, clicks, and advertising. Another point that they were going to do is just suggest that to the jury so the jury makes that connection. And I noticed this pattern because the DNA is the same way. They were going to have 10 DNA experts to come and talk about general DNA practices and talk about how powerful these methods can be in court cases. And I don't know if you need 10 experts to defend this one trace DNA sample, but it goes a step further than that because they were going to have an 11th DNA expert who is another veteran in his field. And then he was going to talk about what all the others didn't, which was actually 2.1.1, the sheath. And he was actually going to talk about all of the case facts that he knew of that are present. And again, they were going to put in front of the jury this inference, this suggestion, so then the jury themselves would just attach all of these powerful methods onto this sheet.
And see, I think part of that, again, just from an attorney standpoint, when you're looking at who's set to testify and who's in trial, and again, Kristen and I are family law attorneys, we're not criminal attorneys, but we do have some experience with experts and testifying, cross-examination, things like that. It sort of goes back to this repeated standard in my mind of like, what aren't we asking? Because I think the same thing is true with the information provided to the media and the public about the DNA and touch DNA and this 1 in 1 trillion odds. That can happen and be created a little more easily than you can possibly imagine in a trial. You have an expert, you have someone that's put on the stand, they're qualified as an expert, and then you're asking them questions that you want to ask them to have them or to elicit the answers that don't hurt your case, right? Like, how can this hurt me? How can this help me? And that's where cross-examination in trial would have been huge in this case, because after any DNA expert, I don't care if you have 10 or 11 of them up there, is going through the state's position, a effective defense attorney would be cross-examining that expert and saying, but based on this, in your opinion, wouldn't this happen? Or isn't this true though? And isn't that true though? And isn't this true? And that's really where I think Kristen and I, we wish in a lot of ways that the trial went through, because that's where I think a lot of this misinformation or misconception based on the small amount of information that we have is sort of born and then like expands to an nth level where you have the public just saying DNA equals he did it.
It's a great point, Sam. And a perfect illustration of this is go back to the Karen Reed trial, right? That is, I think, where Karen Reed and her attorney, Alan, where they completely separated themselves, in my opinion, in that trial. And they really started proving that there was reasonable doubt that this wasn't Karen that committed that crime, is through the expert testimony. For me, the level of, and it wasn't just the qualifications, because I think most of them were qualified and able to be qualified as an expert through the court and to answer the questions. But I think that the experts that the defense had, they just told a better story. They had responses as to, no, it couldn't have happened this way, and I'll tell you why. Not just, oh, it happened. I thought the defense's expert were so much better with explaining all of the questions, who, what, when, why, where, that the experts were relaying. And I really would love to see this, because I don't think a lot of people realize too, the prosecution has their experts, they're hired by the prosecution. Okay. The defense has their experts, they're hired by the defendants. And you then get in the battle of the experts. That's really what it comes down to, but it's going to be who has a better cross-examination to poke holes in that expert's theory.
Yeah, and just to kind of add to that, it seems like what we're doing here is we're confusing random match probability from the probability of guilt. We're saying that because we can say a 1 in a trillion touch DNA, that equals probability of guilt. And not only it sounds like is that cringeworthy because of the way that that is being interpreted in a vacuum, but I think that it is a larger pattern with the whole case. Is there's these small little pieces of information that are causing confusion, and everyone is then concluding, and not everyone, not us, and not people that are really sort of looking at the details of this case, but there's a big general public that is confusing that with the probability of guilt.
You bring up such a great point, because a lot of these DNA likelihood ratios and how they formulate to come up with this output, it's all probability.
Yeah, you put it so simply when you put it in terms like that. Okay, but when you're saying we if we could educate a couple jurors, in the future, it doesn't even have to be Idaho, just across the United States, because I do think that the more educated jurors can be on a lot of things, the more our system will be less flawed. If you could really just educate any jurors that were doing a case that involved DNA, specifically touch DNA, what are things that you would tell them to listen for, to watch out for, to be careful of? Like, I want you to talk like you're just talking to me, and I'm going to be a juror at some point in the next decade on a case, and I'm going to be able to say, Audrey from Glitch, she has me ready for this.
Well, trace DNA is different. It's fragile. It is not a big blood stain. Yes, the court is going to ask, did he do it? Is this his DNA? But you've got the likelihood ratio, but that's only part of it. That's the question. Is it more likely to be the defendant than some unrelated person? But what that doesn't answer is the time. What time did this happen? Was it direct? Was it indirect? So you need 3 other tools, 3 other scientific tools to be able to get you to the answer, and to be able to weigh these answers with the data and the evidence that you have. You need that, the TPPR, transfer, persistence, prevalence, and recovery. How does this DNA behave? Then you have the activity level, the how and the when of the DNA. Did the defendant do the criminal activity? Did the defendant do the alternate activity, the innocent activity? And you have the thresholds and the drop in and drop out. Do we even trust this profile? And so you have all of these 4 questions answering 4 different things, and it's all wound up in one likelihood ratio, and the court is always saying, it's one question. It's always he did it.
So my question, just to kind of circle back to trace DNA, is, so if you're looking at trace DNA, it could be like a skin cell.
Mm-hmm.
Would that be an example of it? So it's possible that the sheath was touched by Brian Kohlberger at some point in time. It's also, though, possible that
it was never touched.
Someone that maybe Brian touched something, and then like person A touches person B, and then person B somehow transfers that to item C. Is that possible? Would that be an example of transfer DNA, or the potential of that happening?
Yes, you put it perfectly. That's mechanism of travel. Yeah.
And I think there's a lot of people that don't understand that, or can't grasp their mind around that. And even just sitting here talking with you is making me understand this process so much more. But I mean, I think it's fascinating, because I'll ask you, Audrey, what do you think was the biggest red flag in this case with the DNA?
They're using trace DNA in a capital case. That should never be. So I had to get out there. Yeah.
And just from everything you've said, Audrey, it sounds like part of that is because there's such a high risk of like it being contaminated or transferred, or it not being essentially what it purports to be. It's not for sure that there is a significant amount of, for example, blood. Brian Kohlberger's blood is not all over the crime scene. There's no way to identify the time of it, and there's no way to really figure out whether or not it's been contaminated. So it could have been like a benign touch. It could have been that he never even touched that object, if I'm understanding this correctly.
Yeah, you bring up a great point, because trace DNA can also be dust that just happens to have human DNA in it. And a lot of people are still running on 1990s DNA education. Science has not stopped. It's actually, it's kept going. So we need to update our 1990s DNA education.
Right.
Have you ever seen any other cases where there has been so little DNA left at a crime scene, where with respect to a defendant pleading guilty to the crimes? Have you ever seen a case where there was so little DNA? Like, that's something I have a hard time wrapping my head around, is how was that the only piece of DNA?
Short answer is it wasn't. That is a high traffic house. There was trace DNA all over that house, and they had male B, C, and D as well. And those were blood samples. So the framing that the state has done to say, oh, this was the only pristine trace DNA profile that was a part of this crime, I've never seen that before.
It's wild. Especially the amount of people that we all know just from all the videos that have gone, that have showed up, is that was a very high traffic house. So there was a lot of people going in and out of that house all the time.
Yeah, and I think then you start taking another step back and go, and also we don't have an identification, but we have a classification of a car. And also we don't have a cell phone that can clearly be marked as being in the house and in the house at that time. So the more we start taking a deeper look into sort of the micro of the case, the more I think that we're all going, this doesn't really make sense. And it doesn't
and to add on to that, Sam, we've never even heard from the DoorDash. We've never even heard anything from DoorDash on whether or not that was a real order, a real driver. I find it hard to believe that she was employed on any level, even as an independent contractor through DoorDash, because of her criminal past. Again, I don't work for DoorDash. I don't know what their criteria is, but we have never heard from anybody from DoorDash about this. And you're right, we haven't heard from Amazon on the behavior, or how many clicks, or how many search terms. We haven't really heard from any of these experts to support these things that they're throwing out there and that people are gravitating to and taking it as truth. Well, this was awesome. I know that I have a whole bunch more questions. Sam, do you have anything? I'm going to ask you a question. I think I know the answer, which makes me feel really smart right now. But in your view, Audrey, what are the biggest policy gaps in how courts are using trace or low level DNA right now? And I think I want to hear your answer, but I think I might be able to get this one right.
I think it's those 4 DNA tools: the likelihood ratio, TPPR, activity level, and these thresholds, drop in and drop out. And one of these things is, the true crime community is absolutely amazing at piecing together timelines, taking all of this complex data and talking about it. And I've told them before, you are in a zone where policymakers dream to be. And if you can just roll that back one more step and start asking about the rules, I think that would be a great thing to start bridging these gaps in this policy, because if the public nudges a little bit, I think that can go a really long way. If we just kind of understand how this works, that's all we really need to do at this point, is just listen to it, see how it lands.
No, I agree with you. And it sounds like the quality control being so subjective and inconsistent, depending on who's running it, what is the lab. I see that being a big issue with respect to the results that come out.
I call that the DNA slot machine, because you're inputting
That is
data.
a good one.
You really don't know their thresholds, what they call an allele, what they don't, what is dust, because you can have 4 or 5 different lab techs in the same lab, let alone multiple different labs. They'll be looking at the same exact abstract, and they'll come to a different answer because of their opinion of what they're calling an allele and their software settings and their thresholds. So you just kind of
Wild.
DNA slot machine.
It sounds sort of obvious that there's so much confusion based on the true variability associated with even just testing. Even if everyone's doing their own standard or testing, it's like if it's reasonable in any way in the industry to come to different conclusions, I would believe that you would need to be, not necessarily that it's being hidden, but you need more information behind the conclusion. You need a lot more information behind the conclusion. So it sounds to me like you should be, and everyone should be, highly skeptical of a quick conclusion associated with DNA until you've actually looked at, okay, well, is this reliable? What type of DNA is it? How was it tested? Where was it? Where did it come from? What sort of procedure was used? Was it tested by a different source? And what does it even mean? And it sounds like, most importantly, what doesn't it mean? What can't you conclude from it? Like in this case, in the Idaho 4 case, to me, it seems quite crucial to be able to say, yeah, and we can place him at the crime because of the DNA. And I think the suggestion that we have DNA that's linked to him is that we can, in fact, place him at the crime. But it sounds like what you're saying is, no, we can't. We absolutely can't place him at the scene of the crime. And we can't even put a time on it. And we can't even verify whether or not it's been contaminated. And we can't verify actually any of it.
Bill Thompson actually said at the plea hearing, they come.
Oh, wasn't that wild when he said that we can't put him at the scene? He even said that at the acceptance, at the plea acceptance, when he was changing his plea. He said it again, and that to me has always been one of the biggest things. I mean, Sam and I were sitting there watching that live, and we kept saying, okay, there's got to be a smoking gun. You got to give us something that is concrete, black and white, 100%. They have him in the house. And then what does he do? He gets up there and says, well, we actually can't put him in the house. It's crazy.
And then you also have Riley Nolan, the lab manager at ISP. She was speaking or testifying at the redacted hearing. I think it was January of 2025. It's on the website. She was saying what we like to do in forensic science is we like to see if we can connect the defendant to an object or the object to the defendant. And that's what they do in forensic science. So then you have the lab telling you what their role is. And then you have the prosecutor saying, we didn't actually have the lab perform their role.
Wow.
It is, yeah. Wow. I know, a lot of wows.
I think it just goes to show that just because something is labeled evidence doesn't mean it's good evidence. And that's sort of a reoccurring theme as an attorney is, there are things that are evidence, but some evidence is stronger than others. I think you made the point quite well with the difference between identification and classification of the car. Not all evidence is the best evidence, and not all of it proves a crime. And when you're looking at the Idaho 4 case, you're looking at prosecutors needing to meet their burden beyond a reasonable doubt. And this certainly gives me more doubt than it does anything.
We turned over another rock, Sam, and we got nothing but more doubt. And for everyone watching, again, remember this, all three of us on the stage here tonight, this is our opinions, this is our speculations. We do this for entertainment and educational purposes to create this content. But the whole purpose of all three of us, I believe, being out here is to try to get people to ask questions that they have and to not just think because someone tells us this is DNA. Because I truly think that if say Audrey did a press release 2.5 years ago in this case, and was able to explain to us, just like you did here today, Audrey, the difference and the quality controls and how the ISP was something different than Othram and how did Othram get theirs? And I think that if more people truly understood this whole DNA process, and that it would be possible for Brian to get that touch DNA on the sheath without ever stepping foot in the house, that is a possibility, and that we need more information, I think it really could have interjected with respect to the storyline. And I think more people would have objectively looked at this and say, okay, well, they might be saying that, but that's not entirely what's going on. Because I think some of the biggest evidence in this case is, like Sam keeps saying, is it's what they're not telling you and what they're not showing us. They continue to use presumptions and assumptions to connect dots to force feed their position of what they believe happened. And we're not saying that everything didn't happen the way it's being purported, but I definitely think that the lack of evidence is not helping.
And I can tell you
Absolutely, I
that
completely agree.
yeah,
I don't necessarily think what they did in the lab is wrong. It could be right. I don't know. But the main point is we need to be just cautious and ask questions about trace DNA.
yeah, and I think that these are the type of questions that we would want answered on the stand. This is presumably what the defense would be putting on, is not necessarily, like you said. I mean, there can be legitimate answers for these things, but the problem is we don't have all of the information associated with it. And certainly when there's sort of a little like soundbite that says 1 in a trillion, I think that there's a huge possibility for confusion there. So if I'm the defense, that's what I want. I want an expert or 12 to get on the stand and say, look, this is some of the most unreliable DNA around, and here's why, and here's how it can vary, and here's how conclusions can change, and here's why the way that this was actually even obtained, this profile was obtained, is not the correct way. And then I would put some other people on the stand about the potential ripple effect that that had, and the people whom we didn't really look at because of it, potentially.
I agree. And I love your theory too, Audrey, is if you asked five experts from the same lab and you got 4 or 5 different conclusions, that is very, very, very powerful. I mean, and that's where I could see where the multiple experts on each side would come up, because especially on the defense, you're trying to really poke holes in the quality control and the probabilities and the percentages. You're really trying to show that it's not nearly as strong as the prosecution is trying to make it sound. And by doing that, you get 4 or 5 different experts that run the same test and get different answers. And that shows you how weak that touch DNA is.
Yes, DNA was not supposed to be the gold standard. It was supposed to be just other types of supporting evidence. And that was never the goal, to have it the smoking gun.
That's interesting. And in this case, it ended up being probably one of the biggest. I mean, there was one hearing, I can't remember what hearing it was, and this was when my ears kind of perked up really big in this case with respect to red flags. And I think it was when Ann Taylor and her team were introducing the information about the alternative suspects or the alternative theory. And Hippler made a comment along the lines of, but we have his DNA there. And don't quote me exactly on that, but that was the summary. And I remember thinking, first of all, the judge shouldn't say that, in my opinion. And I just remember thinking, wow, if you take that out, what do we have?
Yeah, it seems to be the way that we initially came up with an identification of a suspect. And so if that's not as tight as it is being represented, then I don't know how it is confusing that we are confused.
Okay, I have one last question, Audrey, before we let you go. Because I think it wasn't when the DNA was collected, and I think there was an officer that traveled with the DNA in like a test tube and traveled on a plane, and they went to have it tested. I think it was by Othram in Texas. Correct me if I'm wrong. But did you think there was any change of custody issues that would be concerning there that might somehow manipulate the conclusion or the findings? Do you think all of that was done completely consistent with protocol?
There's always a lot of risk when you're moving that around. From what I understand, because I'm not exactly sure, is that can be standard, but I'm not 100% sure on that.
Yeah, that was kind of something Sam and I talked about. Like, does it have to stay in the refrigerator? How long does DNA last? Doesn't it have to be refrigerated?
Well, you store it in refrigeration, but it definitely has to be, the packaging has to be a certain way. And that would be another great question for a jury or anybody to ask. How was it packaged when you were transporting it?
Yeah. And if it wasn't packaged up to protocol or standards, what potentially could be the effect of that?
Contamination. So then whatever sample Wortham received would have been compromised.
Had a
And if the
completely
sample was
different result.
compromised, what do we have?
Yep, that's like your aha moment. Well, Audrey, this was so amazing, and I am, again, Sam and I are so incredibly grateful. I think, and for anyone watching, if you are watching this premiere with us and you do not subscribe to Audrey, you need to run over to the Glitch Lab. You need to hit that like, you need to hit that subscribe. You need to support her, because the more experts that we have, the more credible this entire community is. It is. You know, we're trying to get more attorneys, we're trying to get more experts, because it educates people. And we can all go out there and talk about DNA, but at the end of the day, I just learned a lot about the touch and transfer DNA process that I had no clue about yesterday. And so I really, really am very grateful, Audrey, for your time, for your education. I hope that we're able to help some potential juror out there at some point know the hard questions that should be asked. And if the prosecution isn't asking those questions, then that should be an automatic red flag.
Thank you so much for having me, Kristen and Sam.
Yeah, no, and thank you for joining us. And if anyone has any other questions for Audrey, let us know, because we'd love to do a part 2. I love this stuff so much. I love trying to figure out how credible each piece of evidence is, because I'll continue to keep my mind open to different theories. And, you know, that's the whole purpose of what Kristen and I are doing, is just looking at everything. We may be wrong, we may be right sometimes, but the point is to ask the questions, because a lot of times when we start asking a question or two, we start getting information that we can even really anticipate. I know for me, for a big part of this case, I considered that there was touch DNA, but I really wasn't spending the time thinking about what that meant. So I'm grateful for you for being on our show, because I think, again, at every turn in this Idaho 4 case, and I'm sure it's true in a lot of other cases too, the more you look, the more you question.
Ain't that the truth? And we are aware that there is potentially some new evidence that's come out over the last couple of weeks. We will be doing hopefully a part 2 with Audrey and the Glitch DNA Lab. So you guys can feel free to send us those through email, message. But please, if you are not subscribing, please go over to Audrey. It helps the algorithm. It helps us as the true crime community. And it also helps us as content creators to just get in front of more people. And I truly think the more people that objectively look at this case on even just one level, the DNA, I think that more people are starting to do it as the evidence continues to come out. So if we can help one person go, hey, there might have been a different suspect, scenario, time frame, and maybe this case should be looked at through a different lens. I think the more we continue to do that, the better. Audrey, you are such a pleasure to work with, and we look forward to part 2. And we can't wait to get everyone's feedback on this, because I think it's such a powerful and important episode.
Thanks for having me.
Until next time, everyone.